Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on negative liberty in the Prohibition machine. The core question is this: how far may government go in the name of order before the promise of liberty starts to look like permission granted only to the obedient? The core competency is to explain how the United States Constitution preserves individual liberty. How far may government go in the name of order before the promise of liberty starts to look like permission granted only to the obedient? The pressure moves through prohibitory text, incorporation, policing, moral regulation, and the recurring question of when public order becomes constitutional trespass. Liberty is often described as a feeling of space. People can speak, worship, assemble, read, publish, travel, and make private decisions without officials breathing down their necks. That instinct is incomplete. Constitutional liberty does not survive on mood. It survives through prohibitions. The Bill of Rights preserves liberty by writing a series of legal refusals into the National Charter. Congress shall make no law abridging speech. Government may not establish religion. Officials may not conduct unreasonable searches. They may not deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That pattern controls the legal design. The Constitution does not begin by promising that government will supply freedom on demand. It begins by telling government no. This constitutional structure treats liberty as a prohibition machine. Negative liberty means freedom from certain forms of government interference. It does not answer every question about justice or equality. It does not promise that private power will behave decently. It does not guarantee wise culture, generous neighbors, or fair employers. It tells the state to stop at certain doors, or at least to slow down, justify itself, and clear formal hurdles before it crosses the threshold. The Constitution preserves liberty by making intrusion harder. The civic problem sits in plain view. A government that cannot act at all cannot protect anyone. A government that can invade conscience, speech, the home, the press, and the body whenever officials claim a public benefit will swallow liberty from the inside. The harder task is to identify which liberties require a flat prohibition, which require case-by-case balancing, and which require citizens to defend boundaries that frightened officials will try to erase. The language of preservation also carries force. The Constitution does not create every liberty from scratch. It recognizes political and moral claims that many Americans believe government should respect. Then it turns those claims into legal commands. That move shifted liberty from philosophy into enforceable text. Once the claims entered constitutional law, citizens could bring them into court, judges could test government action against them, and legislatures could no longer dismiss them as polite suggestions. The founding generation did not agree about the necessity of a Bill of Rights. Federalists argued that the Constitution already limited the national government through enumerated powers. If Congress possessed only listed powers, why add separate warnings not to violate liberties it had never been granted authority to touch? Anti-Federalists did not trust that answer. They had just fought an empire and watched governments claim broad implied authority under pressure. They understood that officials rarely announce, "We intend to become tyrants." Officials claim necessity, efficiency, order, emergency, and moral duty. Anti-Federalists wanted written limits because they expected power to stretch. That fear proved durable. The first Congress proposed the Bill of Rights in 1789 because ratification had left many Americans uneasy about national authority. The resulting amendments did not try to list every human freedom. They targeted the pressure points where government most often intrudes: religion, speech, publishing, assembly, petition, arms, quartering, search, seizure, criminal procedure, jury process, punishment, and the distribution of reserved powers. The structure reveals the designer's priorities. They worried about armies and civilian life, general warrants, coarse confessions, rigged prosecutions, and rulers who treated dissent as disorder. The early Bill of Rights applied only against the federal government. That design reflected the original constitutional structure, but it also created a major gap. State and local governments police daily life far more directly than Congress or the presidency do. Sheriffs search homes. School boards regulate speech and religion. Local prosecutors file charges. City officials issue permits and deny them. Prison wardens control bodies. If the rights text restrained only Washington, liberty would remain exposed where citizens actually meet the state most often. The 14th Amendment transformed that problem after the Civil War. Its due process and equal protection clauses made national rights claims relevant against the states. The Supreme Court later used incorporation to apply most Bill of Rights guarantees against state and local governments. That was not a decorative doctrinal shift. It changed the map of liberty. Once incorporation took hold, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, many criminal procedure rights and related protections became national floor rules for state and local authority. A different system was possible. The United States could have kept most liberty questions inside state law and local democratic control. Some defenders of localism still prefer that model. It would have preserved regional experimentation and reduced federal judicial supervision. It also would have left core liberties vulnerable to geography, majoritarian hostility, and local panic. Incorporation reflects a hard judgment that some prohibitions cannot depend on your zip code. Privacy shows how the system also evolved beyond the text surface. The Constitution does not contain a single privacy amendment. Courts piece privacy doctrine together from multiple guarantees involving home, person, papers, family, bodily integrity, and due process. That development shows both the strength and the tension of negative liberty. Judges sometimes protect liberty by recognizing patterns of intrusion that the text did not catalog line by line. Critics then ask whether the court preserved liberty or created a new constitutional rule. That argument will return later in the course, but here the central point is simpler. The prohibition machine grew because the forms of intrusion grew. The original Constitution relied heavily on structure rather than explicit rights language. Article I enumerated congressional powers, Article II defined executive duties, and Article III established a federal judiciary, but none of that prevented anti-federalists such as George Mason from warning that power would stretch once office holders claim necessity. James Madison answered some of that anxiety in the first Congress by steering amendments through the House in 1789, and the states ratified the Bill of Rights in 1791. Even then, the limits bound only the national government. Barron vs. Baltimore in 1833 made that boundary explicit when Chief Justice John Marshall held that the Bill of Rights restrained the federal government, not the states. The 14th Amendment after the Civil War reopened the entire question by adding due process and equal protection language that later courts used to pull major liberties downward into state and local administration. Gitlow v. New York in 1925, Mapp versus Ohio in 1961, and later incorporation cases turned federal rights from distant parchment into daily restraints on school boards, police departments, licensing offices, and city councils. When liberty claims become real, named officials stand at the center of the story. A school principal orders a campus newspaper to remove an article. A city council denies a protest permit because the message threatens political embarrassment. A prison administrator restricts religious practice in the name of discipline. A police officer enters a home without proper legal basis. A legislature writes a statute that burdens speech, family decision-making, or religious exercise. Citizens then invoke the Bill of Rights as a brake. The First Amendment supplies the clearest example because it protects public conflict directly. Speech, press, assembly, petition, and religious exercise let citizens criticize power, expose corruption, build movements, and resist orthodoxy. If government can silence unpopular expression, it can control the conditions under which every later policy debate occurs. That is why free speech protection remains strongest when the speech irritates, angers, or embarrasses officials. Pleasant speech rarely needs constitutional armor. Religious liberty reveals another layer of pressure. The Establishment Clause blocks government from establishing or endorsing religion. The Free Exercise Clause blocks government from burdening religious practice without adequate constitutional justification. These rules protect believers and non-believers at once. They also generate recurring fights over public school prayer, public funding, workplace accommodation, health regulations, and anti-discrimination law. No government official wakes up thinking, "Today I will violate the Establishment Clause." Officials usually say they are honoring tradition, supporting morality, or accommodating conscience. The prohibition machine forces them to defend those actions under constitutional terms rather than cultural instinct alone. Incorporation made these fights unavoidable in state and local settings. A state legislature cannot treat liberty as a local courtesy revocable by majority impatience. A county sheriff cannot rely on local custom to excuse intrusive search practices. A school board cannot declare that federal rights stop at the edge of the district. The 14th Amendment pulled national liberty downward into ordinary administration. Negative liberty still leaves hard gaps. The Constitution usually restrains government, not private actors acting on their own. A private employer, a private platform, a private university, or a private association may wield massive power without triggering the same constitutional rules, unless statutes intervene. Negative liberty answers the question, what may the state not do? It does not answer every question about coercion in social life. That gap explains why civil rights law later pushes from negative limits toward positive obligations. The machine also depends on courts willing to enforce it. A legislature can pass a rights-violating law, a governor can sign it, a police department can build a practice around it. Liberty becomes more than rhetoric when litigants challenge the action, lawyers build records, and judges issue injunctions or invalidate rules. The prohibition machine needs operators. Text alone does not walk into the courtroom. Technology adds fresh strain. Phones store private life at a scale the framers never imagined. Platforms carry speech instantly across state lines. Government surveillance tools can collect, sort, and retain information in ways that turn modest police work into large-scale monitoring. The old rights remain, but the intrusions become more granular and more constant. That is why liberty preservation now depends on attention to licensing forms, digital monitoring, data requests, school rules, and administrative conditions tucked into ordinary governance. The Bill of Rights speaks in blunt verbs because the framers expected officials to test every softer phrase. Congress shall make no law, landed on paper in 1791, as a direct refusal to let the new national government police dissent the way older regimes had done. The right of the people to be secure, and no person shall be deprived, perform the same move. The text does not flatter office holders. It blocks them. That language becomes sharper when it reaches a real room. A city attorney defending a permit denial leans on order and traffic control. The First Amendment stands there with no law and forces the official to justify the burden under judicial scrutiny. A police officer seeking to search a house confronts secure malus warrants and probable cause, since each word aimed at slowing the hand that wants entry first and explanation later. A prosecutor defending coercive questioning meets the Fifth Amendment's ban on compulsion and finds that the verb itself limits the state's confidence. The 14th Amendment turned these refusals into national weapons against local power. Once incorporation took hold, school districts, police departments, licensing boards, and zoning offices no longer faced only local custom or state statute. They faced a constitutional file that could be carried into federal court. That is why incorporation changed the balance of daily governance. It armed citizens with national language against local convenience. Privacy doctrine shows the pressure point most clearly. Officials rarely announce a desire to erase liberty outright. They request records, expand surveillance, inspect devices, or regulate intimate decisions through administrative forms. Courts answered by reading the Constitution's protections together rather than as isolated fragments. Critics call that invention. Defenders call it self-preservation. The fight persists because every silence in the text tempts some office holder to treat the unlisted space as available territory. The Constitution preserves liberty by building a legal habit of refusal. It tells government that some doors require stronger justification, some commands are forbidden, and some forms of power demand suspicion from the start. That design does not remove conflict. It organizes conflict. Citizens, officials, and judges keep arguing because liberty is not self-executing, and because every age invents new tools of intrusion. Liberty and benevolence are different constitutional questions. Government can sponsor programs, spend money, subsidize services, and regulate markets without necessarily preserving liberty. Liberty preservation means something narrower and more disciplined. It means government stops where the Constitution tells it to stop, or proves why a claimed limit still fits the constitutional rule. A government that delivers benefits while ignoring prohibitions is a convenient government until the wrong official takes the wrong interest in the wrong person. This logic also clarifies the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties usually begin with negative commands against the state. Civil rights often demand government action against exclusion and unequal treatment. A mature citizen must know both traditions. A society that honors only negative liberty may ignore entrenched exclusion. A society that honors only positive obligation may forget the danger of concentrated power. The machine requires both caution and correction. The unresolved judgment remains live. Does liberty survive best when courts enforce hard prohibitions against state intrusion? Or does liberty also require stronger public willingness to defend those prohibitions when officials promise safety, order, and administrative ease? If the public grows comfortable with convenience, the prohibition machine will still sit in the text, but fewer people will bother to turn it on. The unresolved question is whether negative liberty protects citizens from coercion or blocks government from solving collective harm.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.